I am your host, Miss Marple. Welcome to MI Channel Warm Leaves.
The morning of the Bellingham garden party dawned precisely as Mrs. Weatherby had predicted it would, overcast but dry, with the faintest promise of sunshine before the lunch hour. The late August heat had been oppressive for weeks, and the village of Bracton-on-Thames welcomed the prospect of clouds and a gentle breeze. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her usual wicker chair on the terrace of St. Mary's Cottage, set down her knitting and observed the clouds with the same analytical attention she might have given to a particularly troublesome piece of lacework. The pattern interested her. The progression of grey to lighter grey, the way the wind pushed from the west, these were not merely meteorological phenomena, but the rhythm of a day that would alter Bracton forever, though none of the villagers could have known it yet. She had lived in Bracton for nearly 60 years, and in that time she had come to understand that gardens were rather like people. Both required constant attention, both could surprise you with unexpected growth, and both contained secrets buried deep beneath the surface where no one cared to look. The Bellingham estate garden was particularly revealing in this regard. 3 acres of meticulously maintained grounds overlooked the Thames, and Roger Bellingham had spared no expense in its upkeep. Roses trained against south-facing walls, herbaceous borders arranged with mathematical precision, and a small lake stocked with ornamental fish, all the trappings of a man determined to prove his worth through horticultural display. The village had spoken of little else for a week. Mrs. Weatherby, at the post office, had mentioned it to at least 40 people. The vicar's wife had made special arrangements to close the flower rota for the day. Even old Mr. Hastings, who rarely left his cottage, had expressed an interest in attending. The guest list was impressive by Bracton standards: the county magistrate, 3 members of Parliament, the wife of a retired general, and virtually every person of consequence within 10 miles. Roger Bellingham was not an aristocrat, though he had married into mild nobility, and this garden party represented a careful calibration of his social ambitions. He was 58 years old, wealthy from a manufacturing concern inherited from his father and consumed by a need to be recognized as more than merely rich. A successful garden party would cement his position as a figure of local importance. At least, that is what he believed. Miss Marple had known Roger Bellingham's mother years ago before she died, a woman of nervous disposition and considerable beauty, trapped in a marriage to a man more interested in ledgers than in his wife's welfare. The son had inherited his father's preoccupation with achievement, but his mother's underlying anxiety. An interesting combination, Miss Marple had always thought. It produced the sort of man who could be charming at a garden party but cruel in his business dealings, who could smile while calculating advantage. She had observed this pattern many times over the decades, the seemingly confident exterior masking a desperate fear of insignificance. At precisely 2 o'clock, Miss Marple's neighbour, young Margaret Sutton, called for her in the Suttons' motor car. Margaret was technically not young, she was 43, but in Miss Marple's eyes, anyone born in the 20th century retained a quality of youth, a lack of permanence about them. Margaret was dressed in a pale blue frock that had been expensive, but was now 3 seasons old, a fact that Mrs. Weatherby would certainly have noted and commented upon to her various customers. Miss Marple wore her best navy silk, the one she'd bought in 1947 and had carefully maintained. It had not aged because she had not allowed it to. There was a principle involved in such things, though Miss Marple suspected few people understood it anymore. The drive to Bellingham Hall took 8 minutes, and Margaret filled the time with cheerful gossip about the other guests. The magistrate's wife had recently discovered her husband's connection to a woman in the next county. The retired general's wife had been seen purchasing an unusual number of art magazines. The vicar was nervous about how his sermon would be received by so elevated an audience. Miss Marple listened with the focused attention that made people think she was genuinely interested in their chatter, though in fact she was cataloguing information, storing details about human behavior like a squirrel storing nuts for winter. The nervous chatter of an innocent person versus the carefully constructed conversation of someone concealing something. These were distinctions that had become clear to her decades ago. Bellingham Hall appeared through the elm trees gradually, as such estates do, revealing itself section by section. It was neither particularly old nor particularly beautiful, a Victorian house that pretended to Georgian restraint. The gardens, however, were undeniably impressive. The party had already begun, with perhaps 50 guests scattered across the lawn in small clusters, drinks in hand, examining the roses with the particular intensity that people reserve for admiring property. Servants in black and white moved between the groups with trays of canapes. A small string quartet played beneath a cream-colored tent. Everything was arranged with precision, which Miss Marple found rather sad. The best party, she had always believed, contained an element of pleasant accident. Roger Bellingham greeted them at the edge of the garden, his smile almost desperate in its intensity. He was a tall man, runny, to flesh in the middle, with a sort of tan that came from weekend sailing rather than actual labor. His wife, Catherine, stood slightly behind him, as she always did, as though uncertain of her right to occupy the same space. Catherine was 15 years younger than her husband, beautiful in a conventional way, with light brown hair and the sort of vague expression that came from spending too much of one's life adapting to another person's requirements. She wore a coral-colored dress that did not suit her, though Miss Marple suspected this was entirely deliberate, a choice made by Roger rather than by Catherine herself. The afternoon proceeded with the pleasant tedium that characterizes such events. Miss Marple moved through the party observing, always observing. She noticed that the magistrate's wife barely acknowledged her husband. She observed that Margaret kept glancing toward the terrace, where a younger man stood alone, Margaret's cousin from London, recently separated from his wife, she had mentioned in the motor car. She noted that Catherine Bellingham's hands trembled slightly when she held her teacup, and that her eyes followed one of the members of Parliament with an intensity that suggested history. She saw that Roger was drinking more than usual, that his conversation had taken on a slightly forced quality, as though he were reading lines rather than speaking naturally. These observations were not particularly dramatic, but to Miss Marple they were as telling as screams. At 4 o'clock, as the afternoon had begun to acquire that particular golden light that precedes late summer dusk, someone asked to see the library. Roger was delighted. The library was new, he explained, added only the previous winter. He had spared no expense. It was, he said rather proudly, the finest private library in the county. A group of perhaps 12 people, including Miss Marple, followed him inside through the French doors that opened directly from the garden. The room was indeed impressive, 2 stories high, with a balcony running around the second level and books lining every available wall. A ladder on wheels allowed access to the upper shelves. The carpet was Persian, the lighting carefully designed. It was the sort of room that people created not because they loved books, but because they loved the idea of themselves loving books. Roger began explaining the provenance of his collection, and most of the guests began to drift toward particular sections of interest. Miss Marple positioned herself near the tall windows that overlooked the garden. She had always preferred windows. They allowed one to observe while apparently being observed. She was standing there, noticing the way the afternoon light caught in the glass, when she heard the shout. It came from the garden, a woman's cry, high-pitched and urgent, then confusion, raised voices, someone calling for help. The library fell silent. Roger's expression shifted from pride to annoyance to alarm, the progression visible as it passed across his features like weather. He turned and hurried back through the French doors, the guests following like a flock of disturbed birds. Miss Marple rose from her chair with the careful deliberation of age and made her way to the window. What she saw next would occupy her mind for many weeks to come. There, beneath the rose pergola that Roger had been particularly proud of, lay the body of James Hartley, the youngest of the members of Parliament, his face turned upward, his eyes open to the afternoon sky in an expression of pure surprise. The chaos that followed was precisely the sort of organized panic that English people, when faced with genuine crisis, seem to manage with surprising efficiency. Someone had the presence of mind to call for Dr. Urton, who happened to be among the guests. Someone else suggested moving the body indoors, though Dr. Pemberton's expression made clear that such measures were unnecessary. The magistrate, perhaps fortunate in his presence at the scene, immediately took charge of the situation with the air of a man accustomed to authority. Within minutes, The garden party had transformed from an occasion of social advancement into something far more sinister, a crime scene, though no one had yet voiced the word aloud. There remained, in those early moments, the possibility of accident, of some terrible mischance, though the angle of James Hartley's body and the manner in which he lay suggested something more deliberate. Miss Marple, moving with the careful, unhurried pace that age permitted, made her way to the body, but remained slightly apart from the cluster of distressed guests. She observed without appearing to observe, a skill honed over decades of village life. The body lay directly beneath the rose pergola, positioned as though Hartley had fallen from some height above. Yet the pergola itself was only 7 feet tall, hardly sufficient to cause fatal injury. His neck, she noted, bent at an angle that suggested the cause of death was not a simple fall. His left arm was extended, his right arm curled against his body, and beneath his right hand, barely visible against the gravel, was something small and dark. No one else seemed to have noticed it. Dr. Pemberton was checking for vital signs with the thoroughness of a man who knew them unnecessary, and the magistrate was already taking names and establishing a perimeter of sorts, requesting that no one leave the immediate area pending the arrival of the police. James Hartley had been, Miss Marple reflected, as she stood observing the controlled frenzy around the body, precisely the sort of man that villages both welcomed and resented. He was 34 years old, recently elected to Parliament, handsome in the manner that suggested, expensive education and assured confidence. He came from one of the old county families, though his branch had fallen into relative obscurity before he had begun his political ascent. He had bought Crofton Lodge, the largest house in the neighbouring village of Bracton-le-Green, 6 months prior. He had not been a particularly frequent visitor to Bracton-on-Thames, but when he was, he had caused a noticeable disturbance in the social landscape rather as a stone thrown into still water creates ripples that extend far beyond the initial impact. He was charming, ambitious, and possessed of that particular quality of sexuality that certain men seemed to carry as casually as other men carried watches, a thing worn without particular consciousness of its value, but noticed by every person in proximity. Catherine Bellingham was standing near the terrace door, her hand pressed against her mouth. Her face had gone very pale beneath her careful makeup. Miss Marple noticed that she was not looking at the body but rather at her husband, and that her expression was not precisely shock but something more complex, a mixture of horror, and something else that Miss Marple would have identified as guilt if she had been younger and more inclined to premature judgment. But Miss Marple had learned the dangers of premature judgment. Shock frequently wore many masks, and what appeared to be guilt might simply be fear, or complicated memory, or the weight of secrets that had nothing to do with murder. She filed the observation away without drawing conclusions. The police arrived within 30 minutes, which was remarkably swift for a rural area. Inspector Thornton was a man in his 50s, competent rather than brilliant, the sort of policeman who believed that most crimes were committed by obvious people for obvious reasons, and that the job of detection was primarily a matter of identifying which obvious person had been sufficiently foolish to leave evidence. He had worked in Bracton for 12 years, and Miss Marple had observed him with the sort of compassionate objectivity one reserves for those who are fundamentally well-meaning but limited in imagination. He set about the business of investigation with methodical competence, photographing the body, examining the immediate area, and beginning a preliminary round of interviews. Roger Bellingham was in a state of controlled panic. His garden party had become a murder scene. His roses, his carefully tended grounds, his demonstration of social consequence, all of it had been violated by the intrusion of violent death. He moved between the inspector and his gathered guests with the agitation of a man watching his careful plans collapse. He insisted that Hartley had been in good spirits, that there was no reason for such a thing to happen, that it must certainly be some terrible accident. The repetition of these statements seemed to provide comfort, as though by voicing them frequently enough, he might alter reality to match his preferred narrative. Margaret Sutton stood near Miss Marple, her earlier excitement at the garden party entirely evaporated. She looked shaken but composed, which Miss Marple noted with interest. Some people, she had observed, handled shock better than others. Those with little imagination often seemed less disturbed by crisis, as though they lacked the capacity to project themselves into the situation of tragedy. Others, those of more sensitive temperament, seemed overwhelmed immediately. Margaret fell somewhere between these categories, present, aware, but maintaining a certain distance from the horror of events. She had taken Miss Marple's arm, as younger people sometimes did when uncertain, seeking stability. Miss Marple accepted this with her usual gentle manner, though her attention remained focused on the scene before her. By late afternoon, the police had established that James Hartley had died from a blow to the back of the head, delivered with considerable force. The small, dark object beneath his hand proved to be part of a bronze sundial finial, the sort of decorative piece that one might find in any well-appointed garden. Roger Bellingham recognized it immediately as belonging to the sundial that stood on the upper terrace near the library windows. The finial had been broken off, and the edges were sharp and bloody. The weapon, then, was identified, though not yet the mechanism by which it had been used. No one had seen Hartley climb to any height. No one had observed anyone striking him. He had simply been found beneath the pergola, dead, as though death had found him there and decided to stay. The guests were gradually released, though the magistrate requested that no one leave the village for the next several days, pending further investigation. By 6 o'clock, only the police remained, working in the lengthening shadows as the August light began its slow surrender to evening. Miss Marple allowed Margaret to drive her home, her mind occupied with the small details that no one else seemed to have noticed. The angle of the body, the position of the arm, the careful arrangement of the scene, which suggested not the chaos of passionate violence but something far more calculated, and most intriguingly, the peculiar fact that James Hartley's left shoe had been missing, a detail that seemed to have escaped everyone's attention but her own. She had seen it clearly in that moment when the body had been examined, 1 foot shod, 1 foot bare. It was a small thing, perhaps insignificant. Yet in Miss Marple's experience it was often the small things that contained the largest truths about human behavior and the secrets that villages contained within their apparently peaceful boundaries. By the following morning, Bracton-on-Thames had transformed itself into the sort of village that thrives on tragedy. The murder of a member of Parliament was the sort of event that elevated a small community's significance in ways that no amount of garden parties could achieve. By 9 o'clock, reporters from 3 London newspapers had arrived, along with a photographer whose presence seemed to offend the local constabulary far more than the actual murder had. Inspector Thornton, faced with the additional complication of media attention, had become noticeably more defensive about his investigation. He held a brief press conference in which he revealed almost nothing of substance while managing to suggest that progress was being made and that an arrest was imminent. Miss Marple observed this display on the wireless in the sitting room of St. Mary's Cottage and found it rather telling about human nature, the tendency to project confidence in the absence of actual knowledge. She had spent the morning as she spent most mornings, tending to her garden and working on her correspondence. A letter had arrived from her nephew Raymond, updating her on developments at Scotland Yard, where he held a position of some minor importance. Raymond was a good man, though he shared the masculine tendency toward overconfidence that seemed to plague most of the police force she had encountered over the years. He wrote of his cases with the certainty of someone who believed that evidence was objective and therefore conclusive, apparently never having considered that evidence might be selected or interpreted in ways that supported predetermined conclusions. Still, his letters were valued, and Miss Marple maintained the correspondence with the regularity that such things required. The discovery of James Hartley's missing shoe had, as Miss Marple had rather expected, been noticed by the police eventually. It had been found approximately 30 feet from the body, partially hidden beneath a hedge near the boundary of the Bellingham property. This discovery had thrown the investigation into a state of confusion, as the position of the shoe suggested that perhaps Hartley had been struck while standing, had stumbled or been dragged, and had eventually collapsed beneath the pergola. This narrative seemed to satisfy Inspector Thornton, who began to focus his investigative efforts on identifying who might have been on the grounds in the relevant time period, and who might possess a motive for violence toward a man of Hartley's standing. The fact that nearly 70 people had been present at the garden party seemed not to discourage him, though it had clearly made his job substantially more complicated. Miss Marple received visitors throughout the day, which was not unusual following any event of significance in village life. Mrs. Weatherby called at 11 o'clock, ostensibly to deliver a pot of her excellent blackcurrant preserve, but primarily to share information and gather additional intelligence. She had been at the garden party, positioned near the refreshment tent, and had observed various details that she felt obligated to report. The magistrate's wife had seemed distracted. Catherine Bellingham had gone pale when informed of Hartley's death, though perhaps not more pale than any civilized woman would become. Roger Bellingham had immediately begun calculating the damage to his social position, which seemed, Mrs. Weatherby implied, rather an inappropriate priority under the circumstances. What Mrs. Weatherby found most intriguing, however, was the nature of Hartley's activities during the party. He had arrived L.A. Tea, she explained, perhaps an hour after the initial gathering. He had been somewhat distant, moving through the crowd without engaging in conversation with the usual degree of charm. He had spent perhaps 20 minutes in conversation with the magistrate, the nature of which Mrs. Weatherby had been unable to ascertain, despite her careful observation. He had then attempted to speak privately with Catherine Bellingham, though Roger had intervened with remarkable speed and had redirected the conversation toward the library tour. Within moments of entering the library, Hartley had excused himself to view something in the garden, stating that he wished to examine the new pergola that Roger had been describing. No one had seen him after that until his body had been discovered. Following Mrs. Weatherby's departure, Miss Marple allowed herself an hour of quiet reflection in her garden. The afternoon was warm, the light golden, the sort of day that seemed designed to mock the presence of violent death in the world. She sat in her wicker chair, ostensibly reading but primarily thinking, a process that required her to move through events as they had occurred and to consider what details might indicate motive, means, and opportunity. Motive was particularly interesting in this case because James Hartley had possessed the sort of personality that generated motives in abundance. He was a man who had advanced through society on the basis of his appearance, his charm, and his family connections, rather than on any demonstrated capacity for genuine achievement. Such men frequently accumulated enemies as they proceeded through life, particularly among those whom they had offended or betrayed in the pursuit of their own advancement. Margaret Sutton called in the late afternoon, appearing somewhat nervous and bearing a cake that her mother had made. The gesture seemed unnecessary. The CA key was obviously pretext for the visit, but Miss Marple accepted it graciously and offered tea. Margaret had something on her mind. This was clear from the way she turned the teacup in her hands and avoided direct eye contact. Eventually, she revealed that she had known James Hartley somewhat, having met him at various social functions over the past year. He had been charming, she said, which seemed a word everyone used when referring to him. He had suggested that they might dine together in town, an invitation that Margaret had tactfully declined, despite finding him interesting. She had not, however, mentioned this to her husband, Gerald, as Gerald could be jealous and difficult about such matters. Miss Marple listened to this confession with her usual gentle attention, offering no judgment, which seemed to relax Margaret considerably. More significant, however, was Margaret S.'s observation that on the morning of the garden party, she had seen James Hartley's motorcar in the drive of Bracton Lodge, the rented house where he stayed when visiting the area. He had been loading something into the boot, a leather case of some kind, she thought, though. She had only glimpsed it from a distance. This detail seemed to strike her as potentially significant, though she could not articulate precisely why. Miss Marple found herself quite interested in this information. The loading of luggage suggested potential flight, which suggested guilty knowledge of some sort. One did not flee unless one was running from something, and one did not run from something unless one had reason to believe that remaining would result in unpleasant consequences. After Margaret had departed, Miss Marple spent the early evening making inquiries of her own. She telephoned Mrs. Armstrong, who lived adjacent to Crofton Lodge and had a reputation for noticing the comings and goings of her neighbours. Mrs. Armstrong confirmed Margaret's observation and added the additional detail that Hartley's landlord had called the previous week requesting payment of the remaining lease, which suggested financial difficulties. Furthermore, she had observed that Hartley had received a visitor the previous evening, a woman, she believed, though she had not observed clearly enough to identify whom. The woman had arrived in a motor car and had remained for approximately 2 hours. The visit had seemed somewhat agitated, Mrs. Armstrong suggested, based on the raised voices that had been faintly audible from the road. By the time Miss Marple had concluded her telephone conversations, the evening had grown dark, and the events of the previous day had acquired that quality of unreality that violent death sometimes assumes when one has not witnessed it directly. Yet the facts remained, and they painted a picture of a man in some kind of difficulty, a man who had been attempting to conceal something from someone, a man who had made an unscheduled visit to the garden party where he had encountered multiple people before his death beneath a rose pergola. The missing shoe remained peculiar, and the more Miss Marple considered it, the more she became convinced that it represented something far more deliberate than accident. Someone, she suspected, had wished for it to appear that Hartley had been running, that he had been fleeing from something or someone. But the careful placement of the body beneath the pergola suggested no panicked flight, but rather something calculated, something arranged. The question that occupied her mind as she prepared for bed was the simple but troubling question of why. The police investigation, which had begun with such apparent confidence, began to lose momentum as the second day progressed into the third. Inspector Thornton had conducted interviews with all 70 guests, but the sheer number of potential suspects had rendered the process more of a bureaucratic exercise than a genuine investigative endeavor. Everyone had an alibi of sorts. No one had been completely alone at the moment of Hartley's death, yet simultaneously everyone had been sufficiently occupied that no one could account with precision for the movements of anyone else. The library tour had provided cover for multiple people to slip away from observation. The garden itself, with its various hedges and planted areas, offered abundant opportunity for concealment. The time of death remained somewhat uncertain, Dr. Pemberton having established only that Hartley had died sometime between 2:30 and 4 o'clock, which encompassed the entire period during which the party had been in progress. The matter that seemed to occupy Inspector Thornton most heavily was the question of motive. He had begun to develop a theory, one that Miss Marple learned of through the efficient gossip network of village life, which seemed to operate far more reliably than official channels. Hartley had apparently been involved in some form of financial impropriety during his business dealings before entering Parliament. A constituent from his constituency had contacted the police, having seen an article about the murder in the newspaper, and had suggested that Hartley might have been engaged in some form of fraud involving investment schemes. The constituent, a businessman named Patterson, had lost a significant sum of money and had been attempting to investigate Hartley's involvement. Patterson had attended the garden party, had been observed in conversation with Hartley, and now seemed to be emerging as the inspector's preferred suspect. This theory had a certain appeal. It provided clear motive, it identified a suspect with financial motivation, and it offered the sort of straightforward narrative that satisfied most people's sense of how crimes occurred. A man wrongs another man financially. The wronged man confronts him, a violent altercation ensues, and death results. Yet Miss Marple, reviewing the details of Patterson's presence at the party, found herself unconvinced. Patterson was a methodical businessman of 60 years, the sort of man who conducted his affairs with careful precision and had little to lose and much to gain from Hartley's discrediting through legal channels rather than through murder. Furthermore, Patterson had been observed by multiple witnesses throughout the afternoon, and his timeline did not seem to allow for the sort of access to Hartley that would have been required to strike him with the bronze finial. What interested Miss Marple far more was a conversation she had with the vicar's wife on the afternoon of the third day following the murder. Mrs. Halliwell, as the vicar's wife was known, had called to discuss the arrangements for the upcoming flower festival, which seemed to Miss Marple an almost obscene demonstration of normalcy in the face of violent death. Yet such was the nature of village life. Death occurred, the living continued, and social obligations persisted regardless of interruption. During their conversation, Mrs. Halliwell mentioned, somewhat hesitantly, that she had observed something at the garden party that she had reported to the police, but that the inspector seemed not to have found particularly significant. She had seen, Mrs. Hallowell explained, Catherine Bellingham entering the library approximately 15 minutes before Hartley's body had been discovered. This was not remarkable in itself. Many people had entered the library during the afternoon. What was remarkable, however, was that Catherine had appeared distressed, and she had been carrying a small key which she had used to unlock a drawer in the desk near the window. The desk was Roger's, apparently kept locked to prevent unauthorized access to his correspondence. Catherine had removed something from the drawer, Mrs. Hallowell could not determine what, and had then relocked it and departed. This behavior had seemed suspicious to Mrs. Hallowell, though she acknowledged that it might be innocent, Catherine being the mistress of the house and therefore entitled to access its contents. The inspector, when informed of this observation, had apparently dismissed it as irrelevant to the investigation. Miss Marple found this information considerably more illuminating. It suggested that Catherine had been searching for something in her husband's desk, something that required a key and that had apparently justified the risk of being observed engaging in secretive behavior at a public function. It suggested further that Catherine had been concerned about that something, that she had felt it necessary to locate and perhaps remove it during the party. The question that naturally arose was what object or document could have motivated such behavior, and what connection it might have to the murder that had occurred within minutes of her removing it from the drawer. She decided to exercise one of the privileges of age, and attempted to call upon Catherine at Bellingham Hall. This was not a particularly subtle approach to investigation, but Miss Marple had learned that directness, tempered with apparent innocence, frequently yielded information that more elaborate schemes produced only after considerable effort. She presented herself at the door mid-afternoon, explained that she had been in the area and had wished to inquire about Catherine's well-being following the distressing events, and was admitted with the sort of surprised politeness that one afforded to elderly visitors whose intentions seemed obviously benign. Catherine Reck eaved her in the morning room, which was decorated in shades of pale grey and cream, colours that seemed to match Catherine's own faded quality. She appeared to have aged considerably in the 3 days since the murder, the careful makeup doing little to conceal the exhaustion beneath it. She seemed both relieved and anxious at Miss Marple's presence, as though uncertain whether the visit represented an opportunity or a threat. They discussed the weather, the tragedy of the murder, the difficulties that such events created for a village's social fabric, and the various arrangements that the police had imposed regarding the house and grounds. Only when Miss Marple had established a certain rapport through these preliminary civilities did she allow the conversation to drift toward more personal matters. She mentioned, as though it were merely casual observation, that Catherine must be finding the experience quite distressing, particularly given that she had been one of the last people to see Hartley before his death. Catherine's response was interesting. She seemed to tense at this statement, and her hands, which had been resting in her lap, clenched visibly. She denied having seen Hartley at all, having remained primarily in the garden, had not entered the library until well after the discovery of the body. The denial was too emphatic, too detailed, too defensive. It was precisely the sort of response that innocent people did not typically produce. Innocent people usually said simply that they had not seen the deceased, had been elsewhere, and had nothing to add. They did not construct elaborate defenses against accusations that had not been made. Miss Marple, having received confirmation of what she had begun to suspect, allowed the conversation to return to safer topics and soon took her leave. She walked back to St. Mary's Cottage, with her mind occupied by a pattern, was beginning to emerge from the chaos of events. Catherine had searched Roger's desk for something. Roger had been observed behaving with more anxiety than seemed warranted by the murder alone. Catherine had been observed watching Hartley throughout the party with an intensity that suggested personal interest. And now Catherine was lying about her movements, attempting to conceal something. Whether she was attempting to conceal involvement in the murder or merely involvement in something else entirely remained an open question. But it was a question that Miss Marple was beginning to suspect held the key to understanding what had occurred beneath the rose pergola. The hidden clue, when Miss Marple eventually discovered it, came not through deliberate investigation but through the sort of fortunate accident that seemed to characterize much of her detective work. She had been invited to take tea with the vicar and his wife on the afternoon of the 4th day following the murder, an invitation that she had accepted partly out of genuine affection for both parties and partly because the vicar's house offered an excellent vantage point for observing various comings and goings in the village. It was while she was ascending the stairs to the vicar's study, having been invited to admire his recently acquired collection of botanical prints, that she observed something rather remarkable in the hallway window. The hallway window overlooked the rear gardens and, beyond them, the boundary between the vicarage grounds and Bellingham Hall. It was this window that had caught Miss Marple's attention, because she noticed quite clearly in the afternoon light the impression of muddy footprints on the exterior glass. This was not in itself particularly remarkable. Windows became dirty regularly, and the recent rain had produced an abundance of mud throughout the village. What was remarkable was the pattern of the footprints and what they suggested about their creation. They were concentrated at a particular height on the glass, approximately where a person's hand might reach if they were attempting to wipe something from the window or were pressing their face against it to observe something within. More intriguingly, one of the footprints appeared to be a bare foot, which seemed an improbable state in which to be wandering through gardens during wet weather. Mrs. Halliwell, upon being questioned, suggested that the footprints had appeared sometime during the night of the previous day, and that she had simply assumed they were the result of some neighborhood child's mischief. The window faced away from the house and was rarely observed, being accessible only through the garden. Upon closer inspection, Miss Marple noted that the window frame itself showed signs of recent disturbance, minute scratches around the lock, as though someone had attempted to manipulate it with a tool of some kind. The window had not been forced open, but the scratches suggested that someone had contemplated forcing it, or had perhaps attempted to do so before abandoning the effort. This discovery, while seemingly minor, began to construct in Miss Marple's mind a picture that differed substantially from the official narrative. James Hartley had apparently been barefoot at the moment of his death, or had become barefoot during the events leading to it. Now Miss Marple had discovered evidence suggesting that someone had been attempting to access the vicarage from outside, someone whose bare foot had left an impression on glass. The vicarage was directly adjacent to Bellingham Hall, separated by little more than a hedge and approximately 50 feet of open ground. The proximity seemed unlikely to be coincidental. She began, in her characteristically indirect manner, to ask various questions of various people about the night in question and about the weather conditions. She learned from Mrs. Weatherby that there had been a heavy rain beginning around midnight and lasting until approximately 3 in the morning. She learned from young Mr. Davies, who kept the petrol station and fancied himself an amateur meteorologist, that the rain had been quite violent, the sort of downpour that would have rendered the ground thoroughly muddy. She learned from Mrs. Armstrong, Crofton Lodge's observant neighbor, that there had been a motor car at Crofton Lodge the night before the murder, one that she did not recognize, arriving at approximately 10 o'clock and departing at around 1 in the morning. The pattern was beginning to suggest itself with increasing clarity. Someone had driven to Crofton Lodge on the night before the murder. Someone had apparently left that location and had attempted to gain access to the vicarage in the early hours of the morning following the rain. Someone had been barefoot or had become barefoot during these activities, suggesting flight, confusion, or deliberate disguise of identity. The connection between these events and the murder at Bellingham Hall remained unclear, but Miss Marple had learned that sometimes the path to understanding required accepting seemingly disconnected pieces of information and waiting for them to assemble themselves into coherence. She decided to take a somewhat more direct approach to investigating the financial aspects of the case. She arranged, through her nephew Raymond at Scotland Yard, to receive information about James Hartley's banking records and investments. This was somewhat irregular, but Raymond had learned over the years not to question his aunt's investigative instincts, having seen them prove accurate with remarkable frequency. The information that returned, several days later via post, was quite illuminating. Hartley had been living substantially beyond his means for the past 2 years. His investments had been performing poorly, and he had made several substantial withdrawals from his accounts in recent months without any corresponding income that would justify them. Furthermore, there were indications that he had been borrowing money from private sources at apparently quite unfavorable rates. The financial situation painted a picture of a man in considerable difficulty, a man facing potential ruin. More intriguingly, one of Hartley's recent substantial payments had been made to an account controlled by Roger Bellingham. The payment was relatively recent, occurring approximately 2 months prior to the murder, and the amount was substantial enough to suggest something more significant than a routine business transaction. This discovery provided Miss Marple with the sort of thread that, when pulled, frequently unraveled entire patterns of deception. If Hartley had been making payments to Roger, what leverage did Roger possess over him? What secret or scandal was Hartley apparently paying to conceal? She found the answer partially through her own observation and partially through the efficient gossip network of the village. Catherine and Roger Bellingham had married 15 years prior, at a time when Catherine had been newly arrived from London and had been considered something of a mysterious and romantic figure. Miss Marple now learned, through careful questioning of Mrs. Weatherby and the vicar's wife, that Catherine had allegedly been connected to some sort of scandal in London before her marriage, something that had required departure from certain circles and a fresh start in the countryside. The precise nature of the scandal had been unclear at the time and had been gradually forgotten as Catherine had become established in village life. Yet in light of the apparent financial payments from Hartley to Roger, a possible explanation presented itself. What if James Hartley had known Catherine in London before her marriage? What if the scandal that had prompted her departure involved him in some way? What if Roger had discovered this connection and had been using it as leverage to extract financial payments from Hartley? Such an arrangement would explain Hartley's financial difficulties, would provide Roger with substantial motivation to maintain silence about whatever Catherine might have done, and would explain why both Roger and Catherine had appeared so distressed at the garden party. Furthermore, if Hartley had decided that the payments were becoming unsustainable, if he had been facing financial ruin, and had determined that paying blackmail was a luxury he could no longer afford, then perhaps he had decided to reveal the truth, thereby destroying the basis for the blackmail scheme entirely. This theory seemed to satisfy various pieces of the puzzle, though it left the question of the murder itself somewhat unresolved. Miss Marple was beginning to suspect that the murder was not the straightforward result of blackmail, but rather something considerably more complex, something that involved not merely financial desperation, but also matters of the heart and personal betrayal. She found herself wondering about Catherine's midnight visitor, about the barefoot intruder at the vicarage window, about Hartley's missing shoe. These elements seemed to form their own pattern, separate from yet connected to the pattern of financial desperation and blackmail. As the evening fell on the 4th day following the murder, Miss Marple sat in her garden and allowed these various threads to wind around each other, waiting for the moment when they might form themselves into coherent pattern, revealing at last what had occurred beneath the rose pergola. The confrontations that followed emerged gradually, like photographs developing in chemical baths, revealing themselves piece by piece rather than all at once. Miss Marple had learned long ago that direct accusation frequently produced nothing but denial and defensive posturing, whereas a carefully orchestrated series of conversations with various parties could frequently produce the sort of unguarded moments in which truth revealed itself. She began with Roger Bellingham, inviting him to take tea at St. Mary's Cottage under the pretext of discussing his garden and offering him the benefit of her horticultural expertise. Roger accepted with apparent pleasure, seemingly relieved to engage in conversation that did not involve murder investigation or police interrogation. During their conversation, conducted in the comfortable sitting room with sunlight streaming through the windows, Miss Marple mentioned, quite casually, that she had heard rumors regarding Hartley's financial difficulties. She expressed sympathy for the young man's apparently challenging circumstances and suggested that it must be difficult for anyone in Parliament to maintain the appearance of prosperity while facing private struggles. Roger's response was telling. He became noticeably tense. His hand trembled slightly as he lifted his teacup, and his eyes acquired that particular quality of calculation that Miss Marple had learned to recognize in individuals caught between truth and deception. He recovered quickly, expressing sympathy for Hartley's apparent difficulties. But the moment of vulnerability had been sufficient. Miss Marple then mentioned, with apparent innocence, that she had been reviewing some historical records at the library and had come across references to London scandal from approximately 15 years prior. She wondered aloud whether Catherine might have been connected to such matters, merely speculating, of course, but curious about how young people sometimes found themselves embroiled in situations beyond their control. Roger became visibly alarmed at this line of questioning. He set down his teacup with rather more force than seemed necessary and insisted that Catherine's past was entirely blameless, that any suggestion otherwise was wholly unfounded and potentially libelous. The vehemence of his denial rather confirmed the inverse of what he was asserting. What emerged from this conversation, pieced together from Roger's defensive statements and his carefully chosen words, was a picture of blackmail conducted with remarkable sophistication. James Hartley had indeed known Catherine in London, where she had been involved in what Roger delicately referred to as inappropriate associations. These associations had apparently involved a relationship with a married man of considerable social standing, a relationship that had become public knowledge and had resulted in Catherine's social ostracism. Roger had discovered this fact shortly after marrying Catherine and had apparently decided to weaponize it. When Hartley's political aspirations had begun to materialize and his financial circumstances had improved, Roger had approached him with a simple proposition: continued silence regarding Catherine's past in exchange for regular financial contributions. It was blackmail, though Roger seemed to believe that his discovery of the information and his marriage to Catherine entitled him to benefit financially from her indiscretion. Miss Marple listened to this confession with an expression of sympathetic understanding, allowing Roger to talk himself deeper into admission without the necessity of direct questioning. By the time Roger realized how thoroughly he had incriminated himself in a conspiracy to commit blackmail, it was far too late. Miss Marple assured him that his confidence was safe with her and that she had no intention of reporting matters to the police unless they became directly relevant to the investigation of the murder. Roger departed in a state of considerable agitation, apparently torn between relief at having confessed and anxiety about the implications of his confession. The conversation with Catherine proved more emotionally complex. Miss Marple invited her to the cottage on the following afternoon, and Catherine arrived looking substantially more haggard than she had during Miss Marple's previous visit. She seemed to anticipate that this conversation would involve discussion of matters that she had attempted to conceal from everyone, including, to some degree, herself. Miss Marple did not approach the subject directly, but rather began with sympathetic discussion of how difficult it must be for a woman to have her past held perpetually over her head, how exhausting the burden of secrecy could become, how damaging it was to exist in a state of constant vulnerability to exposure. Catherine began to cry, quietly at first, and then with increasing intensity, as though the dam that she had constructed around her emotions over 15 years had finally fractured. She confirmed the essential facts of the London scandal, explaining that she had been young and foolish and had allowed herself to become involved with a man who had promised her much and had delivered only disappointment and social ruin. She had fled London hoping to escape that past entirely. She had married Roger believing that she had finally found security and respectability, only to discover that Roger had known about her past all along and had married her precisely because of it, seeing her vulnerability as an opportunity for future exploitation. What Catherine revealed next, however, was considerably more significant than the historical scandal. She explained that James Hartley had contacted her approximately 3 months prior to the murder, revealing that he had known her in London under different circumstances than Roger understood. Hartley had been attempting to seduce her, Catherine said with considerable shame, attempting to renew what he apparently believed had been a romantic connection between them. He had been using his knowledge of the blackmail scheme as leverage, suggesting that if she did not comply with his romantic and physical advances, he would reveal to Roger that his blackmail scheme was compromised, that Hartley had been conducting his own investigation into the matter, and that exposure was imminent. Catherine had resisted his advances, had refused to betray her husband despite her complicated feelings toward him, and had instead confessed everything to Roger in a moment of desperation. This confession had resulted in a remarkable shift in the household dynamics. Roger, faced with the revelation that his carefully constructed blackmail scheme had been discovered and was facing exposure, had apparently decided that the best course of action was to cease the payments and face whatever consequences emerged. More significantly, both Roger and Catherine had apparently concluded that James Hartley represented an intolerable threat to both their security and their reputations. Catherine admitted, with considerable difficulty, that she and Roger had discussed, in somewhat veiled language, how unfortunate it would be if Hartley were to experience some sort of accident, some event that would remove the threat he represented. Miss Marple listened to this confession with careful attention, noting the precise nature of Catherine's language, the way she phrased her statements to admit the general concept while denying specific knowledge of implementatio. Catherine was confessing to complicity in a theoretical sense, while carefully avoiding actual confession to involvement in the murder itself. She was admitting to motive and discussion, but not to action. Miss Marple found this distinction both revealing and professionally frustrating. Catherine clearly possessed knowledge about who had murdered James Hartley, or at least possessed strong suspicions, but she was protecting that knowledge behind carefully constructed linguistic barriers. When Miss Marple gently pressed on this point, suggesting that Catherine seemed to know considerably more about the events than she was articulating, Catherine became evasive. She insisted that she and Roger had merely discussed the situation in abstract terms, that neither of them would be capable of actual violence, that she had no specific knowledge of how or why Hartley had died. Yet the very vehemence of these denials suggested that Catherine was aware of far more than she was willing to admit. Miss Marple eventually released her from the conversation, sensing that further direct questioning would only produce more elaborate defensive structures. Catherine departed in tears, apparently relieved to have confessed her blackmail and her adulatory advances, but equally determined to protect whatever final secret she was harboring regarding the actual mechanism of Hartley's death. By the evening of this day, Miss Marple had confirmed that both Roger and Catherine possessed substantial motive to wish Hartley dead. She had confirmed that they had discussed the situation and had apparently arrived at some shared understanding regarding the desirability of Hartley's demise. Yet she had not confirmed that either of them had actually committed the murder. The question that remained was whether one or both of them had moved from discussion to action, or whether the actual murderer was an entirely different person whose motives and methods remained as yet undiscovered. The missing shoe, the barefoot visitor to the vicarage, the mysterious visitor to Crofton Lodge in the night. These elements remained unexplained and seemed to point towards something more complex than a straightforward crime of passion or financial desperation. Miss Marple found herself increasingly convinced that the solution to this puzzle involved not one murderer, but rather a conspiracy of multiple parties, each with their own secrets and their own reasons for wishing Hartley dead. The revelation that altered the entire trajectory of the investigation came not from Miss Marple's direct inquiries, but from an entirely unexpected quarter. Inspector Thornton appeared at St. Mary's Cottage on the morning of the 6th day following the murder, apparently in a state of considerable agitation. He had received information from the police in London regarding James Hartley's past that had necessitated a complete reassessment of the investigation. Hartley, it transpired, had not been merely a member of Parliament facing financial difficulties and involved in a scheme of blackmail. He had also been engaged in activities that were substantially more sinister and considerably more criminal than anyone in the village had suspected. The London police had discovered, through their investigation into Hartley's finances, that he had been involved in a sophisticated operation involving the procurement and distribution of information regarding the business dealings of various prominent men. This operation was, to all intents and purposes, an organized blackmail enterprise conducted on a considerably larger scale than the private arrangement he had with Roger Bellingham. Hartley had been collecting information about various individuals' financial improprieties, romantic indiscretions, and illegal business dealings, and he had been systematizing this information for the purpose of extracting money from multiple victims simultaneously. The London police estimated that Hartley had been generating an income substantially greater than his parliamentary salary through this criminal enterprise. What made this discovery particularly significant was that it opened entirely new possibilities regarding motive for murder. Hartley had not merely victimized individuals within the village of Bracton-on-Thames. He had victimized people throughout the country, individuals with resources and desperation sufficient to commit violence in order to silence him. The police investigation, which had been focused primarily on local suspects with local motives, suddenly acquired a national dimension. The question of who had murdered James Hartley became exponentially more complicated as the potential suspects expanded from the 70 guests at the garden party to include potentially dozens of individuals throughout the country who might have wished him dead. Inspector Thornton, faced with this complication, seemed torn between relief that the investigation had acquired professional significance and anxiety about the implications of a crime that appeared to involve organized criminal activity. He had begun to contact the London police for coordination of investigative efforts, and he had increased the guard around potential evidence and potential suspects. More significantly, he had begun to reconsider his earlier focus on Patterson, the constituent whom he had briefly suspected, and had begun to consider the possibility that the murder might have been conducted by a professional criminal, rather than by an amateur motivated by personal grievance. Miss Marple, upon hearing this information from Inspector Thornton, found her own thinking significantly reoriented. She had been operating under the assumption that the murder was fundamentally a crime of passion, motivated by personal betrayal, financial desperation, and complicated romantic entanglement. The revelation that Hartley had been operating a large-scale blackmail enterprise suggested that the murder might be motivated by factors entirely removed from the personal dynamics of the village. Yet something about this explanation failed to satisfy her instincts. The careful arrangement of the body beneath the pergola, the missing shoe, the barefoot intruder at the vicarage. These elements seemed too deliberately local to be the work of an external professional criminal. She decided to investigate the matter from an entirely different angle. She had learned, through careful questioning of Mrs. Weatherby, that Roger Bellingham had made a trip to London approximately 3 weeks prior to the murder. The trip had been ostensibly for business purposes, but Roger had apparently spent considerably more time in London than his business affairs would have required. More intriguingly, Roger had apparently met with someone during this trip, someone with whom he had conducted a heated conversation in a hotel lobby, a conversation that another guest had overheard and had subsequently reported to Mrs. Weatherby through the circuitous channels of village gossip. Miss Marple arranged to call upon Roger Bellingham once more, this time without the pretext of horticultural discussion. She informed him directly that she had knowledge of his London trip and suggested that he might find it beneficial to explain precisely what he had been doing during that visit. Roger initially attempted to maintain that the trip had been entirely innocent business matter, but under gentle but persistent questioning, he eventually admitted that he had been attempting to contact someone who might be able to remove the threat that Hartley represented. He had not, Roger insisted, attempted to arrange the murder directly. He had simply been attempting to identify whether there existed some mechanism by which the blackmail could be addressed through means other than continued payment. Roger had apparently located an individual in London who was apparently connected to Hartley's broader criminal organization. This individual had suggested that Hartley's activities were creating complications for other interested parties, and that solutions might be arranged if sufficient motivation were provided. Roger had apparently understood this to mean that if he provided information about Hartley's movements and habits, someone else might be motivated to address the problem more directly. Whether Roger had intended this as a euphemism for murder, or whether he had genuinely believed it represented something less final remained unclear. What was clear was that Roger had provided detailed information about Hartley's planned attendance at the garden party, information that would have allowed an external party to gain access to Hartley at a time when he was, relatively, isolated from protective witnesses or security measures. This confession had the effect of transforming Roger from a peripheral suspect into someone directly complicit in the events surrounding the murder, even if he had not wielded the bronze finial himself. Miss Marple found herself in the awkward position of possessing knowledge that suggested Roger's guilt without possessing absolute certainty regarding his degree of complicity. He had apparently facilitated access to the victim for someone external to the village, but he had not, he insisted, explicitly arranged for murder. Whether the distinction was meaningful remained a matter of legal and moral interpretation. Yet even as Roger made this confession, Miss Marple found herself still not entirely satisfied that she had arrived at the complete truth. The question of the missing shoe remained. The question of the barefoot intruder at the vicarage window remained. The question of Catherine's midnight visitor remained. These elements suggested that the solution to the murder involved not merely the cooperation between Roger and some external criminal associated with Hartley's London operation, but also the participation of someone local, someone with both opportunity and motivation, separate from Roger's attempted arrangement. Miss Marple spent the evening reviewing the facts of the case as she understood them. James Hartley had been murdered by being struck on the back of the head with a bronze finial. His shoe had been removed and placed at some distance from his body. Someone had attempted to gain access to the vicarage in the early morning hours following the murder. Catherine had been searching Roger's desk on the day of the murder. Someone had visited Crofton Lodge the night before the murder. Roger had facilitated contact between external criminals and information about Hartley's movements. All these elements seemed to point toward a conspiracy involving multiple parties, each with their own secrets and their own motivations. Yet the central question remained unresolved: who had actually struck the blow that had killed James Hartley, and what had motivated that specific act of violence? Miss Marple suspected that she was approaching the answer, but the final elements of the puzzle remained elusive, hidden somewhere in the intersection between local secrets and external criminal enterprise. The psychological test that Miss Marple engineered required considerable planning and a degree of manipulation that she did not particularly enjoy, but found occasionally necessary. She had come to understand, over decades of observation, that people frequently betrayed their guilt not through dramatic confession, but through subtle physiological responses to carefully constructed situations. Fear, guilt, shame. These emotions produced recognizable patterns in how people breathed, where they directed their eyes, how their hands trembled or remained suspiciously still. She decided to construct a scenario that would place the true murderer in a position where maintaining their carefully constructed facade would become increasingly difficult. She invited a select group to St. Mary's Cottage on the afternoon of the 7th day following the murder, ostensibly to discuss village matters and to share information that she believed might be relevant to the police investigation. The invitees included Roger and Catherine Bellingham, Margaret Sutton, the vicar and his wife, and Inspector Thornton himself. The gathering was casual on its surface, taking place in Miss Marple's sitting room with tea and biscuits, but Miss Marple had orchestrated every element with the precision of a conductor arranging a symphony. As they settled into their seats, Miss Marple began to discuss the murder in measured tones, presenting it not as an unsolved crime, but as a puzzle whose solution was becoming increasingly clear through careful observation of human behavior. She spoke of motive and opportunity, of the various suspects and their respective vulnerabilities to suspicion. She discussed with apparent innocence the peculiar details that had struck her as significant: the missing shoe, the barefoot intruder, the visitor to Crofton Lodge. She presented these details as though they were establishing a narrative that led inevitably toward a particular conclusion, though she did not explicitly name that conclusion. What Miss Marple was actually doing was watching the faces of her assembled guests with the careful attention of someone reading a foreign language slowly and word by word. Catherine Bellingham sat rigidly on the edge of the sofa, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. Roger appeared to be listening with apparent interest, though his eyes held that particular quality of calculation that suggested he was considering the implications of Miss Marple's statements and attempting to determine what she actually knew versus what she was merely theorizing. Margaret Sutton sat with unusual stillness, her expression neutral, but her breathing slightly elevated. The vicar and his wife listened with the polite attention that such gatherings required, though Miss Marple detected in Mrs. Hallowell a particular intensity of interest that seemed to exceed what the situation would ordinarily warrant. At a carefully chosen moment, Miss Marple shifted the direction of her discussion. She began to speak about the nature of love and betrayal, about how sometimes people were motivated to commit terrible acts in defense of individuals they cared for deeply. She spoke about the psychology of murder, how it was frequently not a rational act but an ional one, how it could emerge from a moment of passion or desperation, how it frequently involved someone stepping outside the boundaries of their normal character in response to an intolerable situation. As she spoke, she watched Margaret Sutton, and she observed the precise moment when Margaret's carefully maintained composure began to fracture. Margaret's hands trembled, her breathing became irregular, her eyes acquired a glossy quality that preceded tears. Miss Marple continued speaking as though she had not observed this transformation, addressing her remarks to the group in general, while actually directing them toward Margaret specifically. She spoke about how people frequently protected those they loved by absorbing guilt themselves, how loyalty could motivate someone to accept consequences that they had not earned, how love and crime frequently became intertwined in ways that transcended ordinary morality. At this point, Catherine Bellingham made an unexpected move. She rose from the sofa and crossed to Margaret, placing a hand on her shoulder in a gesture of comfort and solidarity. The gesture was revealing. It suggested a connection between Catherine and Margaret that extended beyond casual village acquaintance, a connection that implied shared knowledge or shared complicity. Miss Marple allowed several moments of silence to extend, watching as the two women communicated through proximity and touch what neither seemed willing to articulate verbally. It was Inspector Thornton who finally broke the silence. He had apparently recognized, as Miss Marple had intended, that something significant was occurring in his presence. He turned toward Margaret and asked directly whether she possessed information relevant to the investigation that she had not previously disclosed. Margaret seemed on the verge of responding when Catherine spoke instead. Catherine admitted, with considerable difficulty, that she had been aware of Margaret's involvement in the events surrounding Hartley's death, and that she had been protecting that knowledge out of personal loyalty and sympathy for Margaret's circumstances. This admission opened the floodgates. Margaret, with Catherine's hand still resting on her shoulder, began to explain the true sequence of events that had resulted in James Hartley's death. It transpired that Margaret and James Hartley had been romantically involved approximately 2 years prior, before his political aspirations had solidified and before he had begun his systematic blackmail enterprise. Margaret had believed that their relationship was genuine, that Hartley had cared for her as she cared for him. She had been devastated when Hartley had terminated their relationship abruptly, replacing her with a woman from London whose family connections he believed would be more beneficial to his political advancement. More significantly, Margaret had discovered only weeks before the murder that Hartley had been using information about their relationship as part of his blackmail scheme. He had apparently been threatening to expose details of their intimate relationship to Margaret's husband, Gerald, unless Margaret's family provided him with financial contributions. Gerald knew nothing of the blackmail, and the thought of her husband discovering her infidelity had driven Margaret to increasing desperation. She had contacted Hartley, had confronted him, had begged him to cease the blackmail. Hartley had refused, had suggested that he would continue the threats indefinitely unless Margaret provided him with access to her family's substantial financial resources. It was at this point that the events had taken a turn toward violence. Margaret had apparently gone to Crofton Lodge on the night before the murder with the intention of confronting Hartley one final time and of attempting to reason with him, or, failing that, to threaten exposure of his broader criminal enterprise. This was the mysterious visitor that Mrs. Armstrong had observed arriving at the lodge. What had transpired between Margaret and Hartley during that nocturnal visit remained somewhat unclear, but it apparently involved heated argument and the dissolution of whatever remained of civility between them. Hartley had apparently made threats regarding Margaret's family and had suggested that he would contact Gerald directly with information about their affair. Margaret had fled the lodge in a state of considerable distress, apparently without shoes, having run through wet grass and mud in her emotional turmoil. The following day, at the garden party, Margaret had apparently encountered Hartley again. She had apparently followed him into the garden and onto the upper terrace. What had occurred there, according to Margaret's halting explanation, was not premeditated murder but rather a moment of passionate violence driven by desperation and rage. Hartley had continued his threats. He had suggested that her family's social position would be destroyed, that her marriage would be ruined, that her life as she knew it would be obliterated unless she complied with his demands. In response to these threats, Margaret had apparently seized the bronze finial from the nearby sundial and had struck him once with considerable force. The blow had been sufficient to kill him, though Miss Marple suspected that Margaret had not intended to kill him so much as to silence him, to stop the endless stream of threats and manipulation. What had followed was panic and attempted concealment. Margaret had apparently removed Hartley's shoe, attempting to stage the scene to suggest accident or external violence. She had apparently attempted to gain access to the vicarage that night, though her purpose remained unclear. Perhaps to dispose of evidence, perhaps to contact Catherine, perhaps simply to flee in desperation. Catherine, having somehow become aware of what had transpired, had apparently decided to protect Margaret from exposure, had sheltered her with lies and misdirection, had deliberately searched Roger's desk not for evidence of blackmail, but for the key that would have allowed Margaret to hide something within the house without leaving evidence of her presence. As Margaret's confession unfolded, Miss Marple found herself experiencing the complicated emotions that such moments always produced in her. She had solved the mystery, had identified the murderer, had exposed the truth that had been concealed beneath layers of deception and protective loyalty. Yet the solution was not satisfying in the way that justice was supposed to be satisfying. Margaret Sutton was not a criminal in any conventional sense. She was a woman driven to desperation by a man's systematic cruelty and by the threat of exposure of her own moral failings. Whether she deserved the full weight of criminal law, or whether mitigating circumstances should apply, was a question that no longer belonged to Miss Marple, but rather to judges and juries and the machinery of official justice. The revelation produced the sort of stunned silence that typically accompanied the moment when carefully constructed fictions collapsed into undeniable truth. Inspector Thornton seemed momentarily paralyzed, his expression cycling rapidly through surprise, comprehension, and the realization that what had begun as a relatively straightforward investigation had evolved into something considerably more complicated and considerably more tragic. Margaret sat with her hands clasped in her lap, her confession apparently having produced a state of almost serene resignation. Kath. Erin remained standing beside Margaret, her hand still resting protectively on the younger woman's shoulder, her expression one of defiant loyalty despite the legal implications of her complicity in concealment. It was Miss Marple who broke the silence, speaking with the gentle but inexorable authority that came from possessing complete knowledge of events. She addressed Margaret directly, asking her to confirm certain details of her account, allowing Margaret to elaborate on points that remained unclear. Through this careful questioning, a more complete picture emerged of the sequence of events that had culminated in murder. Margaret confirmed that she had gone to Crofton Lodge on the evening prior to the murder, had argued with Hartley for approximately 2 hours, and had left in an emotional state that had bordered on hysteria. She had removed her shoes while fleeing, having stepped out of them in her panic, and having simply continued running through the wet grass without retrieving them. That night, Margaret had apparently attempted to contact Catherine, having sensed that Catherine possessed knowledge of Hartley's blackmail activities. Catherine, with considerable courage and considerable risk to herself, had agreed to help Margaret and had spent the night devising strategies for concealment and protection. It was Catherine who had suggested that the events at the garden party might be made to appear accidental if the circumstances were arranged carefully. It was Catherine who had advised Margaret to return to the party the following day, to behave with apparent normalcy, and to allow the investigation to proceed along its natural course, while she and Catherine worked to obscure the evidence of Margaret's involvement. The morning of the garden party, Margaret had apparently taken sleeping draught provided by Catherine, had rested, and had arrived at Bellingham H, all in the early afternoon, appearing composed and relatively untroubled, despite the turmoil occurring within her mind. She had observed Hartley arriving late, and had watched as he moved through the party with the characteristic arrogance that she found both compelling and contemptible. When Hartley had excused himself to view the pergola, Margaret had followed at a discreet interval, had confronted him once more on the upper terrace, and had attempted one final time to reason with him or to persuade him to cease the blackmail. Hartley had apparently been in a particularly cruel mood, had mocked her desperation, had suggested that her suffering amused him, and had explicitly stated his intention to contact her husband within days. He had also made references to other women whom he had victimized in similar fashion, suggesting that Margaret was merely one among many whose lives he had systematically destroyed. This catalogue of his cruelty, combined with his apparent pride in his capacity to cause suffering, had apparently produced in Margaret a moment of absolute clarity followed by absolute rage. She had seized the bronze finial, had struck him once with considerable force, and had watched as he collapsed to the ground. The violence had been sudden and brief, lacking the theatrical quality that one might expect from premeditated murder. What had followed was panic and a sort of disconnected confusion. Margaret had apparently removed Hartley's shoe in an attempt to stage the scene, then had fled back into the library and had rejoined the party, maintaining her composure with remarkable discipline until the body had been discovered. She had apparently planned to dispose of the shoe herself at a later opportunity, had apparently intended to allow the investigation to conclude that the death was accidental, had apparently believed that she could maintain her deception indefinitely. Yet the weight of secrecy and the knowledge of what she had done had apparently become increasingly unbearable as the days had progressed. Catherine had maintained her protective posture throughout these revelations, offering no defense of her own actions but also refusing to minimize or mitigate what Margaret had done. She acknowledged that she had deliberately concealed evidence, had lied to the police, and had actively worked to obstruct the investigation. She acknowledged that her motivations had been personal loyalty rather than justice or truth. She acknowledged that she understood the legal implications of her actions and accepted the consequences that might follow. Her tone suggested someone who had made a conscious choice between legal propriety and human loyalty, and who remained convinced, despite the potential costs, that she had chosen correctly. Miss Marple observed all of this with the complicated mixture of emotions that complicated human situations produced in her. She had not solved this mystery primarily to facilitate the incarceration of Margaret Sutton or the legal punishment of Catherine Bellingham. She had solved it because the truth mattered, because understanding what had occurred and why it had occurred seemed to her a fundamental requirement of civilized society. Yet understanding did not necessarily imply approval of punishment, and Miss Marple found herself occupied with questions about justice that extended well beyond the scope of Inspector Thornton's investigation. She turned to the inspector and suggested with careful diplomacy that while the facts of the case seemed clear, the interpretation of those facts might deserve consideration of mitigating circumstances. She spoke of Hartley's systematic cruelty, of his organized blackmail enterprise, of his apparent pleasure in causing suffering to others. She suggested that while murder was certainly wrong, the murder of someone actively engaged in such systematic cruelty might be understood as something other than premeditated criminal act. She noted that Margaret had not planned the murder in advance, had not sought to profit from it, had acted in a moment of desperation and rage rather than with calculated intent. She suggested that the circumstances surrounding the death might warrant judicial consideration of reduced culpability. Inspector Thornton listened to these arguments with the expression of a man confronted with considerations that extended beyond his usual professional framework. He was a practical man, accustomed to clear categories of guilt and innocence, accustomed to the machinery of law proceeding along predictable paths. Yet he was also a man of genuine moral sensibility, and Miss Marple's arguments seemed to resonate with something in his conscience that recognized the distinction between abstract law and the complicated realities of human motivation and human suffering. He eventually stated that the decision regarding charges and prosecution would rest with the Crown Prosecution Service rather than with himself, but he acknowledged that the circumstances surrounding the murder seemed sufficiently complicated that a prosecutor might reasonably consider charges less severe than murder. He arranged for Margaret to be taken into custody pending formal investigation, though he allowed Catherine to accompany her, and he arranged for legal counsel to be contacted on Margaret's behalf. Miss Marple provided the contact information for a solicitor in the county town, whom she knew to be both capable and sympathetic to cases involving complicated moral dimensions. As the gathering dissolved and the various parties departed from St. Mary's Cottage, Miss Marple found herself sitting alone in her sitting room, occupied with the peculiar emptiness that followed the resolution of a mystery. The truth had been revealed, the murderer identified, the investigation effectively concluded. Yet the sense of satisfaction that such conclusions ought to produce remained elusive. Instead, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the various tragedies that had converged to produce this moment: Hartley's systematic cruelty, Margaret's desperate love and her moral weakness, Catherine's complicated loyalty, Roger's attempted arrangement with criminal elements, the various victims of Hartley's blackmail whose lives had been damaged by his predatory activities. The murder had not created these tragedies, but had merely been the culmination of them, the point at which desperation had transformed into violence. The legal proceedings that followed occupied much of the attention of Bracton-on-Thames for the subsequent weeks, though the intensity of the village's interest gradually diminished as the immediate drama of revelation faded into the more tedious reality of judicial process. Margaret Sutton was initially charged with murder, but the Crown Prosecution Service, upon reviewing the circumstances and the mitigating factors that Miss Marple and her solicitor had carefully documented, eventually reduced the charge to manslaughter. Catherine Bellingham was charged with obstruction of justice and conspiracy to conceal evidence, charges that carried considerably less severe potential penalties than those facing Margaret. Roger Bellingham, having facilitated access to the victim for external criminal elements, faced charges related to conspiracy and accessory after the fact, though the precise nature of his involvement remained somewhat ambiguous in legal terms. The trial, when it eventually occurred in the autumn assizes, attracted considerable media attention. The story combined elements that the press found irresistible: a member of Parliament murdered in an English village, a woman driven to violence by systematic emotional abuse and blackmail, the revelation of organized criminal activity at the national level. Yet the trial also produced something more significant than mere sensationalism. The evidence regarding Hartley's systematic blackmail enterprise and the scope of his predatory behavior became public knowledge in ways that the police investigation might have kept confidential. Various individuals whose lives had been damaged by Hartley's activities came forward, and the portrait that emerged was not of a charismatic young politician of great promise, but rather of a predatory psychopath who had utilized his intelligence and charm to systematically destroy other people's lives. The judge, in his summing up, noted that while the law could not condone violence, it was possible to understand the desperation that had motivated Margaret Sutton's act. He suggested that Hartley's behavior had created circumstances in which a previously law-abiding woman had been driven to actions that she would never otherwise have considered. He acknowledged that this understanding did not absolve Margaret of responsibility for her actions, but that it might appropriately be taken into account in determining appropriate punishment. Margaret was ultimately sentenced to 5 years' imprisonment, a sentence that seemed to the various observers in the courtroom to represent a balance between acknowledging the seriousness of her crime and recognizing the extraordinary circumstances that had produced it. Catherine Bellingham received an 18-month sentence, suspended pending good behavior, and probation lasting 3 years. The judge indicated that, while Catherine's actions in concealing evidence were legally serious, her motivations had been personal loyalty rather than criminal self-interest, and her actions had not prevented justice from ultimately being achieved. Roger Bellingham, facing the most complex legal situation of the three, eventually negotiated a plea agreement that resulted in a sentence of 2 years' imprisonment. The criminal elements with whom he had attempted to arrange Hartley's elimination were pursued separately through the London police, and eventually faced more serious charges related to organized criminal activity. Miss Marple attended portions of the trial, sitting quietly in the spectators' gallery and observing the proceedings with the calm attention that she brought to all forms of human behavior. She watched as Margaret testified, explaining her actions with a combination of remorse and defiance, refusing to present herself as merely a victim despite the genuine victimization she had experienced at Hartley's hands. She watched as Catherine testified, her loyalty to Margaret evident in every word, her willingness to accept legal consequences for her actions, demonstrating a moral courage that transcended the law's judgment. She watched as the various witnesses regarding Hartley's broader criminal activities testified, painting a picture of systematic predation that extended far beyond the boundaries of Bracton-on-Thames. After the trial concluded, Miss Marple received a letter from Margaret. The letter had been written from the women's prison, where Margaret was serving her sentence, and it was characterized by a tone of acceptance rather than bitterness or self-pity. Margaret wrote of her coming to understand, during her imprisonment, the nature of her own complicity in her victimization. She acknowledged that while Hartley had certainly been predatory and cruel, she had also made choices: to conceal her affair from her husband, to submit to blackmail rather than seeking help, to allow desperation to override reason. She wrote that her sentence seemed to her not unjust, but rather the inevitable consequence of her actions and her choices. She thanked Miss Marple for solving the mystery and for offering Margaret the opportunity to tell her story truthfully rather than having it distorted by investigation and speculation. Miss Marple kept Margaret's letter and reread it on occasion, finding in it a certain wisdom about the nature of consequence and responsibility that seemed to her the most important lesson that the entire tragic affair had produced. She had solved the mystery not by discovering hidden evidence or exposing carefully concealed lies, but rather by understanding human nature with the sort of depth that came from decades of observation and reflection. She had recognized in Margaret's behavior the patterns of desperation and moral compromise that she had observed countless times in village life, patterns that suggested that circumstances could drive previously law-abiding individuals to actions that they would never otherwise consider. The village itself gradually returned to its customary rhythm, though the memory of the murder lingered like a ghost, reminding the residents that beneath the surface of peaceful domesticity lay the potential for violence and tragedy. The Bellingham estate remained on the market for months before eventually being sold to a family from Surrey who had no connection to the previous occupants. Roger Bellingham, upon his release from prison, apparently chose to relocate to the south coast, apparently having concluded that his social position in Bracton-on-Thames had become irretrievably compromised. Catherine departed to London, where she apparently found employment in some capacity related to social work, and where she apparently lived quietly. And without public notice, Miss Marple resumed her customary life, tending her garden, corresponding with her nephew Raymond, taking tea with various friends and acquaintances, and continuing the quiet observation that had characterized her existence for so many decades. Yet something had shifted in her understanding of the world, something that the resolution of the Hartley murder had clarified. She had come to realize with greater clarity than ever before that the distinction between law and justice was not merely academic, but represented a genuine tension at the heart of civilized society. The law had pronounced its judgment, had assigned sentences, had attempted to restore order through the machinery of punishment and incarceration. Yet whether this constituted genuine justice or merely the vindication of legal procedures seemed to Miss Marple a question that admitted no simple answer. She had solved the mystery, had revealed the truth, had identified the murderer and the complicated circumstances that had produced murder. Yet in solving the mystery, She had not solved the larger moral questions that the case had raised. She had not answered the question of how society ought to treat someone driven to violence by systematic cruelty and abuse. She had not answered the question of whether punishment served the purposes that society believed it served, or whether it merely perpetuated cycles of violence and suffering. She had not answered the question of whether her own role in exposing Margaret's crime had represented a triumph of truth or a tragedy of human weakness and desperation. These questions occupied Miss Marple's thoughts as autumn progressed and the village settled once more into its customary patterns. The roses that had bloomed so beautifully at the Bellingham estate garden party faded and died, their brief season of beauty ending, as all seasons eventually ended. The pergola beneath which James Hartley had died was eventually removed by the new owners of Bellingham Hall, though its continued presence represented an intolerable reminder of the violence that had occurred there. The village gossip gradually shifted from discussion of the murder to discussion of other matters. The vicar's renovation plans, Mrs. Weatherby's decision to retire from the post office, the expected arrival of a new family in the cottage adjacent to St. Mary's. Life continued, as life always continued, with the resilience and adaptability that characterized human existence. The aftermath of resolution brought with it a peculiar quality of reflection that Miss Marple found herself unable entirely to suppress, despite her usual preference for accepting events as they occurred and moving forward into whatever came next. The case had demonstrated, with unusual clarity, the ways in which apparently ordinary people could be driven to extraordinary actions when circumstances became sufficiently intolerable. Yet it had also demonstrated something else, something that troubled her more deeply, the way in which the pursuit of truth could sometimes produce outcomes that seemed to serve neither justice nor the genuine welfare of the individuals involved. She had been asked, in the weeks following the trial, whether she regretted exposing Margaret's guilt, whether she believed that allowing the mystery to remain unsolved might have produced a superior moral outcome. She had considered these questions carefully before responding, and her conclusion was that she did not regret her actions, though neither could she claim that her actions had produced uncomplicated good. The first substantial change in the village came with Margaret's mother, who had apparently decided that she could not bear to remain in Bracton following her daughter's imprisonment. She sold her house and departed to live with relatives in Devon, leaving behind decades of connections and community involvement. Her departure seemed to Miss Marple emblematic of the wider damage that the murder had produced, not merely to the individuals directly involved, but to their families and their connections, the ripples extending outward in ways that neither contained nor predictable. Margaret's husband, Gerald, had apparently stood by his wife initially, had attended the trial, had visited her regularly in prison. Yet Miss Marple learned, through the reliable channels of village gossip, that their marriage had effectively ended, that Gerald had begun proceedings for divorce, that he apparently felt unable to reconcile Margaret's infidelity and her violence with the woman he had believed himself to have married. The psychological impact on the broader village was more subtle but no less significant. The murder had revealed that Bracton-on-Thames contained within itself depths of human complication that the surface appearance of peaceful domesticity had concealed. The residents had been forced to acknowledge that people whom they believed they knew well, Catherine with her quiet loyalty, Margaret with her apparent contentment, Roger with his social ambitions, contained hidden aspects of their personalities and their lives that might at any moment erupt into violence or deception. This acknowledgement seemed to produce a certain wariness in village interactions, a subtle shift toward greater caution in social relationships, a recognition that the comfortable assumptions that characterized small-town life might rest on foundations considerably more fragile than previously believed. Miss Marple observed this shift with the objective compassion that she brought to all forms of human behavior. She understood that communities, like individuals, pass through periods of disillusionment and reorientation when confronted with evidence that contradicted their preferred narratives of themselves. She understood that this period of adjustment would eventually pass, that the village would gradually construct new narratives and new understandings that would allow continued social coherence and continued functioning. Yet she also understood that something fundamental had shifted, that the innocence of unknowing had been lost, and that the village would never quite return to the state of naive assumptions that had characterized it before the murder. She found herself particularly concerned with the situation of Catherine Bellingham, who had apparently experienced a crisis of conscience in the months following the trial. Catherine had written to Miss Marple, expressing her sense of having betrayed not merely the law, but also some fundamental part of her own moral code by conspiring to conceal evidence and by protecting Margaret at the expense of truth and justice. Catherine had apparently come to understand, through the process of legal proceedings and imprisonment, that her loyalty to Margaret, however humanly understandable, had been predicated on a rejection of accountability and responsibility. She had written, in language that suggested considerable psychological turmoil, of her growing conviction that she ought to have encouraged Margaret to turn herself in, ought to have forced Margaret to face the consequences of her actions, rather than attempting to shield her from them. Miss Marple had responded to Catherine's letter with a carefully composed response that acknowledged the legitimacy of Catherine's moral confusion without offering false comfort or easy absolution. She had written that the distinction between loyalty and complicity was not always clear, that human relationships often placed people in situations where no course of action seemed entirely defensible, and that Catherine's current reflection, while painful, represented a form of moral growth that was itself valuable. She had suggested that Catherine might find meaning in her probation period by engaging in work that could help other women in situations of victimization and abuse, allowing her own experience to serve some constructive purpose rather than merely being consigned to the past. Whether Catherine had taken this suggestion to heart, Miss Marple could not ultimately determine, though letters that arrived in subsequent years suggested that Catherine had indeed become involved in social work and had apparently found some measure of peace through directing her energy toward helping others. This outcome seemed to Miss Marple to represent one of the few genuinely positive results that the tragedy had produced, not the triumph of justice or the satisfaction of mystery solved, but rather the transformation of suffering into constructive action and the possibility that harm might be transmuted into benefit. The broader investigation into James Hartley's criminal activities continued long after the trial concluded, extending into the following year as various police departments coordinated efforts to identify and prosecute other individuals involved in his blackmail enterprise. The revelation of the systematic nature of Hartley's predation produced considerable public outcry and led to parliamentary inquiry into the circumstances that had allowed such activities to continue undetected. Various reforms were apparently implemented regarding financial oversight and ethical standards for members of Parliament, though Miss Marple observed these developments with a certain skepticism regarding whether reforms of structure and procedure could meaningfully address the underlying human capacity for cruelty and exploitation. What struck Miss Marple most forcefully, as the months gradually progressed and the intense focus on the Hartley murder diminished, was the realization that understanding the mystery had not fundamentally altered the moral complexity of the situation. She had identified that Margaret had committed murder, had exposed the circumstances that had motivated the murder, had facilitated the legal processes that had resulted in Margaret's imprisonment. Yet none of this had resolved the underlying questions about justice and morality that the case had raised. Margaret remained imprisoned, Catherine remained burdened by her complicity, Roger had lost everything he had worked to build, and James Hartley remained dead. The machinery of law had functioned, the guilty had been identified and punished, society had reaffirmed its taboo against murder, yet whether any of this had produced genuine good or had merely perpetuated cycles of suffering remained unclear. This recognition was neither depressing nor liberating for Miss Marple, but rather represented a deepening of understanding that she had been gradually accumulating over decades of observation. She had learned that life did not resolve itself into neat narratives with clear conclusions about good and evil, that human behavior was motivated by complex mixtures of love and selfishness, loyalty and betrayal, courage and cowardice. She had learned that solving mysteries did not automatically produce satisfying conclusions, that truth-telling did not necessarily lead to justice, and that the exposure of crime did not necessarily result in genuine social benefit. These recognitions seemed to her not to diminish the value of seeking truth, but rather to complicate it, to suggest that truth-seeking was important not because it produced clear answers, but because it represented a commitment to understanding the world as it actually existed, rather than as people wished it to be. As autumn gave way to winter, and the village gradually prepared itself for another year of seasonal cycles, Miss Marple found herself at peace with the resolution of the Hartley case, not because she believed justice had been perfectly served, but because she recognized that perfect justice might be an impossible ideal, that human society operated in the spaces between absolute truth and absolute error. That meaning emerged not from solving problems, but from the ongoing effort to understand and respond to human suffering with compassion and wisdom. The window that had opened itself at Bellingham Hall during the events preceding the murder had revealed depths of complication and pain that had been hidden beneath the surface of ordinary village life, and Miss Marple had looked through that window with her characteristic clarity and had attempted to understand what she saw with honesty and compassion. Winter had settled over Bracton-on-Thames with the sort of quiet insistence that characterized English seasons, transforming the landscape into shades of grey and white, softening the sharp edges of summer's violence beneath layers of frost and occasional snow. It was during this season of dormancy and reflection that Miss Marple received the most unexpected visitor of the entire affair, a letter from James Hartley's younger sister Eleanor, whom Miss Marple had never met, and whose existence she had only learned of through the trial proceedings. Eleanor had apparently been abroad during the murder and trial, but had recently returned to England and had made contact with Miss Marple through the somewhat circuitous channels of village connections. She requested a meeting, suggesting that she possessed information relevant to the case that she believed Miss Marple would find of interest. When Eleanor arrived at St. Mary's Cottage on a cold December afternoon, she proved to be a woman in her late 20s, bearing a remarkable facial resemblance to her brother but possessing none of his. Apparent charm or calculated intensity. She was quiet, thoughtful, and carried about her an air of someone who had spent considerable time in reflection about difficult truths. She explained, with evident difficulty, that she had come to England specifically to meet Miss Marple, because she believed that Miss Marple alone would understand the complexity of what she wished to communicate. Eleanor revealed that she had always known about her brother's predatory behavior, that she had observed his patterns of manipulation and cruelty since childhood, and that she had been unable to prevent them or even to effectively protest against them. She had attempted, on various occasions, to report his activities to authorities, but without concrete evidence and with her brother's sophisticated ability to deny and minimize his actions, her protests had been ineffective. She had ultimately decided that the only course available to her was to distance herself from her brother entirely, which she had done by accepting a position abroad approximately 2 years prior. She had read about his murder with a complex mixture of emotions that she described as including relief alongside horror and sadness. What Eleanor had come to communicate, however, was something that extended beyond the immediate circumstances of the murder. She explained that she had maintained contact with several of Hartley's victims, individuals whose lives had been devastated by his blackmail enterprise. She had learned, from these individuals, details about the breadth and depth of Hartley's predatory activities that had apparently not been fully explored during the trial. She had discovered that Hartley had apparently been embezzling funds from parliamentary accounts, that he had been selling information obtained through his position to foreign intelligence services, and that he had been engaged in activities that suggested not merely criminal behavior, but potentially treasonous conduct. The police investigation had apparently focused so narrowly on the blackmail enterprise and the murder that these broader criminal activities had remained largely unexplored. Miss Marple listened to this information with careful attention, recognizing as Eleanor spoke that the true scope of James Hartley's criminality had perhaps never been fully understood. The murder, in this context, seemed almost a minor incident within a larger pattern of systematic predation and betrayal that extended far beyond what had been revealed in trial proceedings. Eleanor had apparently come to offer this information as a sort of context for understanding what had occurred, as though she believed that Miss Marple deserved to understand the full extent of the evil that Margaret Sutton had eliminated. Eleanor also shared correspondence that she had received from Margaret while Margaret was imprisoned, letters in which Margaret had, apparently, come to understand, through extensive reflection, the nature of what she had done. Margaret had apparently written that while she did not wish to minimize her responsibility for Hartley's death, she had also come to recognize that in killing him, she had potentially prevented him from continuing to victimize others, that her act, while certainly murder and therefore wrong, had also served a protective function that law enforcement and social institutions had apparently been unable to provide. This was not, Eleanor emphasized, Margaret attempting to justify her actions or to escape responsibility, but rather Margaret attempting to understand them with complete honesty and to find some meaning in what she had done. Miss Marple found herself moved by Eleanor's visit in ways that she did not entirely expect. Eleanor represented, in some sense, the voices of all of Hartley's victims, all of the people whose lives had been damaged by his predatory activities and who had been largely invisible in the legal proceedings that had followed his death. Eleanor was suggesting, without quite stating it directly, that perhaps Margaret's act, however legally wrong, had served purposes that transcended simple murder, that had prevented future harm, that had protected others from victimization. After Eleanor departed, having shared her information and apparently having found some measure of peace through doing so, Miss Marple spent several days in quiet reflection. She found herself reconsidering the entire affair from the perspective that Eleanor had provided. She had believed herself to have solved the mystery when she had identified Margaret as the murderer, when she had exposed the circumstances that had motivated the murder. Yet Eleanor's visit suggested that there was a larger mystery that she had perhaps not fully grasped, the mystery of how a man like James Hartley could have operated with such impunity, how a predator could have advanced so far within society despite his crimes, how institutions and individuals had failed to protect his victims. This recognition did not alter Miss Marple's conviction that Margaret had committed murder or that murder was wrong, yet it complicated that conviction in ways that seemed to her important and valuable. It suggested that the legal system's judgment regarding Margaret's culpability, while technically correct, represented only a partial understanding of what had actually occurred. It suggested that sometimes the line between victim and perpetrator, between innocence and guilt, could become blurred in ways that the law's categorical frameworks could not adequately capture. In the spring following Eleanor's visit, Miss Marple received notice that Margaret Sutton had been released from prison on parole after serving 2 years of her 5-year sentence. The Crown Prosecution Service had apparently determined, based on evidence regarding Hartley's ongoing criminal activities and the psychological circumstances of Margaret's crime, that Margaret had served sufficient time and that further incarceration was not warranted. Margaret had apparently accepted her release quietly, without public statement or attempt to vindicate her actions. She had apparently moved to a different part of the country and had attempted to reconstruct her life in relative obscurity. Catherine Bellingham had apparently relocated to Scotland, where she had apparently found employment in social services and had apparently married a widowed schoolteacher whom she had known through her work. Her letters to Miss Marple, which continued sporadically, suggested that Catherine had found a measure of peace through helping others and through building a new life that bore little resemblance to her previous existence in Bracton-on-Thames. Roger Bellingham had apparently emigrated to Australia, apparently having concluded that his previous life was irretrievable and that only complete geographic and social distance could allow him to escape the consequences of his actions and his shame. As summer returned to Bracton-on-Thames and the village prepared itself for another season of growth and renewal, Miss Marple found herself sitting in her garden one afternoon in late June, watching the roses bloom with their annual insistence on beauty and regeneration. A young journalist from a London newspaper had written requesting an interview regarding the Hartley case, apparently wishing to produce an article examining the murder from a retrospective perspective, now that sufficient time had passed. Miss Marple had declined the interview politely, but had provided the journalist with certain observations that she believed might prove ID context and understanding regarding the case. She had written that the murder of James Hartley had not occurred in isolation, but rather had emerged from a complex constellation of circumstances that included institutional failure, individual predation, and human desperation in response to victimization. She had written that while the law had pronounced its judgment and had assigned culpability appropriately according to legal standards, the moral dimensions of the case were considerably more complicated than the legal verdict suggested. She had written that perhaps the most important lesson that the case offered was not about the mechanics of murder or detection, but about the ways in which societies failed to protect their vulnerable members, and about the ways in which individuals, when driven to desperation by systematic abuse and victimization, might act in ways that transcended ordinary morality, while remaining comprehensible as human responses to intolerable circumstances. She had concluded her statement by suggesting that Miss Jane Marple, having spent a lifetime observing village life and human nature, had come to understand that mysteries were rarely solved through the discovery of simple truths, but rather through the gradual accumulation of understanding about human complexity, human motivation, and the ways in which individuals attempted to navigate moral circumstances that admitted of no perfectly defensible choices. She had suggested that the solution to the mystery of James Hartley's death represented not a triumph of detection, but rather a recognition that truth and justice, while important, were not always synonymous, and that understanding required compassion alongside clarity. As Miss Marple sat in her garden that afternoon, watching the play of light through the roses, she allowed herself a rare moment of complete peace regarding the resolution of the case. She had solved the mystery, had identified the murderer, had exposed the truth that had been concealed beneath layers of deception. Yet she had also come to understand, through the process of investigation and reflection, that solving the mystery had not answered the fundamental questions about human nature and human society that the case had raised. The roses continued to bloom, indifferent to human suffering and human justice, and Miss Marple recognized in their annual insistence on beauty a kind of wisdom that transcended the categories of law and morality within which human beings so often attempted to organize their understanding of the world. The window that had opened itself at Bellingham Hall during the events surrounding James Hartley's murder had revealed depths of complication and pain that remained unresolved, even as the mystery had been solved. Yet Miss Marple had looked through that window with her characteristic honesty and had attempted to understand what she saw not merely as facts to be catalogued, but as expressions of human nature in all its complexity and contradiction. And in that understanding, imperfect though it remained, she had found not definitive answers but the ongoing possibility of compassion and wisdom in the face of human suffering, a possibility that seemed to her, as she sat in her garden watching the light fade and the evening shadows lengthen, sufficient for any detective and sufficient for any life.